All right, hello everyone. This is a nice extension from the Q&A of the last session, but I'm going to tell you today about how I make the connection between misophonia brains and non-oral or nasal triggers. My name is Heather Hansen, and I just graduated from The Ohio State University. So this is just a quick little about me. I stole from some of the other presenters, have shots of their campus, so I added a shot of the Ohio State campus. But this is me a week ago, officially graduated with my PhD in psychology with a minor in cognitive neuroscience. And I am passionate about misophonia myself because I also, likewise to a lot of the presenters, have misophonia. So I went into grad school and I was like, I am determined to study this condition. Back in 2017 when I started, as we've kind of been talking about all day, there wasn't a whole lot of research about misophonia. And since that amount of time, I've produced 2 different works that I'm going to talk about today. You may know me in the academic sphere from either of these titles, and some of them have been referenced today already, which is super cool. And these are my lovely advisors who are my co-authors on those papers, Dr. Leber and Dr. Saygin. If you are not in the academic sphere, you might also know me from Milken Institute funded Reddit AMA that I did. So putting a little face to the name there, that is me. And then additionally, if you've been attending these sort of soQuiet events, you might have caught me back in September. soQuiet graciously gave us a student research award and a research grant. And so I presented some of my work that I'm not going to touch on as much today, but I presented some work at the soQuiet session back in September. And I actually want to show you some of the results from that session real quick, if you don't mind. One of the things that we did, and a quick little disclaimer here, if you're someone who gets triggered by the written word of triggers, maybe like look away for the next slide. But in general, I asked during that presentation, what sounds triggered your misophonia? And I allowed them to submit as many as they liked. And you can see the word cloud that got made here with obviously the words that are larger representing more people saying that response. And I found this really interesting. For instance, a lot of these sounds are sounds that are produced by the mouth through the nose. I'm going to refer to these as oral nasal sounds. Things you'll commonly hear, you've heard all throughout today, like chewing or breathing, sniffling, that type of thing. But I want to just pause and notice that that's not the entire cloud. And we've kind of been hitting on today that triggers can include more than just oral or nasal sounds, which I'm glad it feels a little bit more obvious today. But in the past, back in 2017, when I started this, that wasn't the case. This has been, at least when I started my research, misophonia was conceptualized largely as an oral or nasal aversion. And that was the proposed diagnostic criteria. That was how people thought about it. And that's how people studied it. So I was really perplexed by this because in my own experience, I know I am bothered by more than just oral or nasal sounds. And so you'll notice that there are some other patterns as well. So there are other sounds in this list that are still produced by people, but other parts of the body. I refer to these as non-oral or nasal sounds. These can be like hands or feet, things like tapping or footsteps, or things that involve another object, like clicking a pen or typing, for instance. But again, I'm not getting this entire list. So this third category I'm adding sort of just like to encompass all the others. These are kind of my non-human nature, animal, music, all of the rest kind of sounds. You'll notice there's some things like dogs licking or barking. You'll notice there are musical things like wind chimes or just bass sounds, but also just water dripping. So this was very fascinating to me. And I just want to like jump to real quick the poll that you had the option to enter in today of whether or not you were triggered by more than just chewing your mouth sounds. And you see that currently, as of right now, 79% said yes. And this is something that not just anecdotally, I can show in my first 2021 paper, actual data supports this as well. And Dr. Jamie Ward actually showed this earlier, which is super cool. So just to revisit it, I demonstrated in my first paper that people with misophonia actually show more discomfort to all 3 categories of these sounds compared to controls. So we're bothered by more than just oral or nasal sounds. So in general, what I want to kind of leave you with in that intro is that if we are going to figure out what misophonia is, how to treat it, what's going on, what causes it, we need to look at more than just oral or nasal triggers. So let's now transition real quick to what does this look like in the brain, which is the kind of main crux of my talk. But the brain is super complicated. I don't know if you've ever tried to look at a neuroscience paper. If you've opened up my article that I'm describing here, it's kind of not really approachable, admittedly. It's kind of difficult if you're not familiar with these terms. So let me explain the two main kind of methods that I use in my paper in terms that are a little bit more, I don't know, easier to understand. So the first kind of thing that I'm doing in this paper is what we call an fMRI or brain scan. This is kind of answering the question, what regions of your brain are active during a task? But even that can be a little bit, jargony. So here's what we're going to do. Let's take this to an analogy that we all have some more familiarity with. So instead of the brain, let's imagine your brain is like a grocery store. Now, we're all familiar. We've gone grocery shopping before. So let's give ourselves a task. One of my favorite tasks as a California native is to buy avocados. So let's say I wanted to know where in this grocery store would there be activity? Where would there be activity in this grocery store if your task was to buy avocados? You might say, okay, I know avocados are in the produce section. So maybe I'd see some activity, some kind of red light up in the avocado area that you see here. And maybe if I purchased those avocados, I'd then see some activity in the cash register section. These parts of the grocery store would be active in this task. And this is kind of how you get those brain images that we've seen in earlier presentations, where it looks like areas of your brain have lit up, because during the task, these are the parts of the brain that activate. So in addition to scanning and finding out what parts of your brain are active, I did another type of neuroimaging technique, and we call that brain connectivity or functional connectivity, which is answering the question, which regions activate together? And so to bring it back to our grocery store analogy, I was hungry when I made these slides, sorry in advance. So let's say I'm really interested in avocados, and I notice that when people buy avocados, they also tend to buy limes and onions. These things often are activated together because if someone's making guacamole, for instance, they might acquire these two additional items. We could call this your guacamole connectivity, if you will. And similarly, we can kind of, pattern that in the rest of the grocery store. So let's say we find that when people buy tortillas, they're also likely to buy something like ground beef or cheese or beans because they're making tacos. Similarly with desserts, you get the idea. Now, one of the things that's super crucial with this, though, and you might be thinking to yourself, that's not how I shop at all, is that this differs for each person, just like it might differ for different grocery stores. So let's say maybe this is what the pattern of connectivity might look like in like a control participant. But in a person who eats vegetarian, that's not going to be the pattern. This person is not going to have any beef in their diet, so they're not going to have any connectivity between tortillas and beef, for instance, and maybe they'll add onions to other things. They'll add more veggies to their diet. Similarly, if someone's lactose intolerant, you wouldn't have that connectivity with cheese or with dairy. You get the idea. So even though these same regions of your brain exist, the way they're connected might kind of differ depending on the person. So applying this sort of analogy, this logic, I want to know if I can learn about a misophonic's brain by looking at how regions are connected. So in my study, what I did, again, I need to start with a task, or I need to find where those areas are. But instead of buying avocados, my task focused on those two types of trigger sounds I was interested in, whether or not there was an oral or nasal kind of point to misophonia, or whether there was non-oral or nasal evidence either. So focusing on these two things, I gave my participants two tasks. Their first task was to move their mouth in the scanner. So they're physically lying in the MRI scanner, and they're saying the phonemes ba, ga, ra, da over and over again, moving their mouth and lips and tongue and all of that. And this is getting me an activation in the motor area of their brain that is active while they move their mouth. And in addition to that, the second task I'm giving them is to tap their fingers. So this is getting at a non-orofacial or oral nasal sound that is commonly in a lot of triggers, clicking a pen or typing, you often will use your fingers in it. So the second task was to tap their fingers in the scanner, which each of the participants did. And likewise, this is then getting me a section of the brain that is active while that particular person taps their fingers. And I want to note that I'm looking at both the motor areas of where they're tapping their fingers, but also the sensation areas, the sensory areas. So I'm getting both the sensory of your mouth and the sensory of your fingers, as well as the motor areas. Now, similar to avocados, I also have some additional players as well. So these are like the, onions and the limes, if you will. I'm looking at two other main areas that have commonly come up in previous misophonia research as being key players in neuroscience. And so that is the auditory cortex that you see here in blue, representing all kind of things, hearing, how you're interpreting what sounds are, that type of thing, as well as what you see in green. This is the insula that you heard about earlier. This insula does a variety of things. It's a jack of all trades, but things like alerting your attention to certain things or focusing on what's relevant and ignoring what's irrelevant. But also things like disgust or subjective response to pain, a lot of things that could be relevant with misophonia, and we've seen insula come up a lot. So now that I've identified where these regions are in the brain, I'm going to then apply my second method, which is figuring out how these regions connect. So similar to like guacamole and tacos, I'm going to look at what the mouth connectivity is. I'm going to look at how the mouth region connects to these other two auditory and insula areas. And in addition to mouth, we're also going to look at finger to compare it to a non-oral nasal kind of idea. And
the key rounding the corner on 15 minutes.
Okay, great. The key kind of takeaway that I just want to show you here is that when I look at this in misophonia, I see similar differences in connectivity in the mouth regions, but drastically larger, significantly more connectivity with the misophonia individuals. So my main takeaway that I want to leave you with is that non-oral or nasal finger regions connect differently in misophonia brains, which wouldn't make any sense if misophonia was just an oral and nasal condition. And so then to just kind of wrap up, these are takeaways that I want to leave you with. We don't know the cause of misophonia in the brain yet. It's still unknown. But if we're going to do that, we're going to need to expand our understanding of misophonia to include non-oral nasal or non-motor triggers. And this can ultimately help us pinpoint new therapies and treatments. Just to list some limitations, I have kind of a small sample of mild cases, but still show a difference in my groups. And there are kind of some things I'm happy to talk about more about collecting more data or looking over cross development. I'll put up just like my acknowledgements. Here are some links to my papers if you're interested, and otherwise happy to take questions.
Thank you, Heather. So we have some questions. One of the first questions is, wait here, let me undo my screen here in a sec. Someone asked what is happening in the brain before someone is triggered. So since misophonia begins even before hearing a trigger, this is exhausting, the person writes. And maybe this is about maybe this is about anticipation, but maybe it's about something else. How would you respond to this person?
Wonderful question. So actually, I think what I'm showing you in this data is directly answering that question, because one of the key things I want to emphasize in this study is that I didn't actually give my participants in this neuroimaging task any triggers at all. What I'm showing you is how their brain is connected at rest, or what we call at a resting state scan, which means they're not doing anything. This is just what their brain is default. So by default, even before hearing any triggers, someone with misophonia's brain is actually showing stronger connections between the finger area and the insula. So just even anticipation, just even before anything happens, this is what your brain is showing differences in.
That's great. Thank you for that. And someone asks, how might we presume a misophonic brain would respond to non-human sounds like clocks, ticking, pet sounds, etc., which is important to you.
Beautiful question. And one I'm genuinely curious too. So I studied, finger areas because there's a well-known finger region of the brain, and I knew I wanted to expand the oral or nasal kind of idea to be a little farther. That is, I have no idea. Like, there's not a well-known, machine area or like water dripping area of the brain. I think the larger takeaway I want to say is that this study should kind of demonstrate to you that there is more to the brain cause explanation than just this sort of, it's motor or it's mimicry or it's, this kind of abnormal connections here, because there isn't a direct correlate with these machiney noises, and these machine noises also cause triggers. So mine is just like getting your feet wet in what else there could be, but it's obviously not complete.
Yeah, well, a related question that popped up while you were talking is, how might multi-sensory sensitivity impact misophonia from a neural perspective?
Yeah, multisensory sensitivity is interesting. I'd imagine someone with those types of experiences would show not only these kind of connections with auditory cortex, but things with other senses as well. Visual cortex is a huge one in neuroimaging. So I'd imagine that maybe someone with this experience might have abnormally strong connections between visual cortex and these kind of key regions, for instance. But I didn't directly study that.
And what study would you like to see next?
Yeah, genuinely good question. There are so many options. One of the things I'm really interested in is figuring out where in development this happens. Because one of the things we could do is study someone's brain across time, grab them as a child, see how their brain is developing, and figure out which of those people are developing misophonia, and see if we can then predict which connections or which areas of the brain are then leading to or predicting misophonia onset. So if we can better kind of see what's happening earlier on, we can then intervene earlier on, which is a huge perk.
Yes. So here are two kind of personal questions that I'll consolidate. One person is wondering what you studied as an undergraduate that prepared you for this work that led you to this. And then someone else wonders what your own experience with misophonia was like, severe or mild, etc. And how have you learned to manage to get to this point?
Yeah. All great questions. So going in order, I studied in my undergraduate the major psychobiology, so a mix of psychology and neuroscience altogether. But I think as you've learned today, misophonia is pretty multidisciplinary. So I don't think you're going to go wrong in wherever kind of field, find which area of misophonia you're interested in and major in that. And then you can just study what questions you want to in grad school. That was my strategy. How I went about I think my misophonia is maybe in the more mild to medium category. I luckily don't suffer from it super severely, but the way that I have coped, and honestly, my biggest advice to people is to tell people about it. I think my misophonia has gotten better in grad school, partially because everyone knows I study it. So I don't feel shame in being like, hey, that's a bothersome noise to me, because everyone's like, oh yeah, that's the thing. That's her thing. So I think just explaining it to people and making people more aware of it has then made it less likely that I'll be bothered by someone, or that they'll make a triggering noise accidentally, or it's just easier all around.
That's good. That's good. So someone asks if you believe your research confirms the top-down predictive model of perception in general.
Very good question. So I think in general, my research is supporting a kind of idea that there is a higher level top-down sort of, there's a bigger social issue going on in misophonia. And let me explain that a little bit. So there's kind of two routes. There's like a bottom-up route where perhaps the actual input, the auditory signal itself, is causing you distress. Or there's maybe the kind of more like top-down, or I'm believing it to be a certain thing, and kind of the way I'm interpreting it is then kind of causing me distress. And I think it's more the latter than the former. Because one of the things that I am finding in my own work, and I think has been repeated in some of these prior neuroimaging studies too, is that the actual primary auditory cortex of your brain, the thing that's just reading in what frequencies are and whatnot, does not show any differences between misophonics and controls. It's only the higher level auditory stuff, the part of your brain that's doing like, what is that sound? Or like, what does it mean for me? Or like figuring it out, those areas show differences. And so I think that it's more of like a top-down, how you believe things to be, what your experience with that sound is, that type of thing. So yes, asterisk, more work needs to be done.
Well, and the second part of this person's question was a little fatalistic, saying, oh, if this is so, if it is proving the top down, can't we just get conditioned to get more and more triggers? Isn't that going to be possible?
Good question. Conditioning is definitely in the territory that is less of my research focus. I know that's definitely like a doomsday way of thinking about things, and I hope that that is not the case. But I can't really speak to that super well. But sorry, that's not really a hopeful ending to that question. But yes, I'm with you.
Yeah, that's okay. There are many things we just don't know. So here's another question related to some that we had earlier about neural pruning, I think, is let's see. or is it synaptic pruning that should have happened but did not? Is misophonia related to synaptic pruning that should have happened but did not, perhaps due to environmental or genetic conditions?
Great theory. As far as I know, I don't have evidence to support or deny that, and I haven't seen anything come out related to that. I think that is definitely a good goal of future study, is to look at misophonia at earlier ages before pruning occurs. Pruning is like the elimination of kind of neuron connections that you don't really need or don't really use. So I think that once we see some results from developmental studies, I'd be more interested in that question, but I don't know for sure.
And someone else is asking about the top-down and bottom-up processes. Misophonia really is both. That's what you're saying, but perhaps more weighted on the top-down part?
I think both is always the answer. Like, I would never be someone who's just like, it's definitely caused by this one thing. But I think that what makes misophonia unique compared to things like hyperacusis or tinnitus is that it does involve more of that higher level perception. The fact that you could be bothered by your mom chewing, but not by the stranger chewing as much. Or like if you're stressed out, you're bothered more than if you're not stressed out. So even though the acoustic properties are the same, your reaction is different. And I think that kind of clues you that there is more to the puzzle than just, the bottom up auditory input.
Yeah, yes. So I know that you said that when you started in 2017, there was even more emphasis on orofacial triggers than there is now. Do you have any concerns about how the research is going just generally? Because there still really is a predominant narrative that it's an orofacial primarily, or not even, it's not primarily like you have to be triggered by chewing to really have misophonia. So
yes,
yeah, thoughts on that?
Wonderful question. So that is one of my biggest things I advocate, is that researchers include a variety of trigger sounds in their studies or personalize their triggers, as one of the researchers did earlier in the morning, which I think is phenomenal, because this allows you to then study whatever more triggers than just your small basis. And as we've kind of hit on earlier in the morning, misophonia research can kind of be a little bit circular, like you get out what you put in. So if you define misophonia as just an oral or nasal kind of condition, and then you only use oral or nasal sounds, you're then going to get out information about oral or nasal aversion. So I kind of want to put in more to the equation, and I want to make sure that we're studying both people with a wider variety of triggers, but also using a variety of triggers in our studies.
Yeah, good.
Which is why, I guess just a quick plug if I can, Chris mentioned earlier, I have a sound bank now that we've posted online. It's the free open access Misophonia Stimuli sound bank with that exact goal. It's just to have multiple exemplars, multiple instances of each of the trigger sounds, so people can use more than just oral or nasal. They can, make their stimuli specific to each person depending on their own triggers, things like that. Still work in progress, but that is on the table.
That's amazing. That's pretty cool. So along those lines, what are you doing next? What's up ahead for you next year?
Great question. So I'm actually stoked. I'm excited to join the Concordia University team in Montreal. So I'm going to transition up to Montreal, and we're going to work on a giant neuroimaging database of misophonia adults, in addition to just some general questions about how like sleep or like stress impact misophonia. So still in the neuroimaging sphere, expanding our sample size, just seeing what more you can find with, misophonia brains.
Well, congratulations. That's pretty awesome. Yeah. So we're going back to the top-down versus bottom-up processing question, and someone asked, do you think this push and pull of bottom-up and top-down processing dysfunction may be different depending on how chronic someone's misophonia is? Like kids' misophonia may be predominantly driven by sounds, up, bottom up, whereas adults may be more top down. Could it possibly flow and differentiate over time too for people?
I think that's definitely possible. I think a lot of like top down processes are often driven by experience with the world, experience with certain triggers. So kids lack some of the experience adults do. So I'd imagine that as you age and as you get more familiarity with things and more experience with different sounds, I could definitely then see your top-down processes coming online a little bit more, being a little bit more active. But again, that's one that's kind of hard to speak to confidently without evidence or studies specifically addressing it.
Yes, yeah. Well, speaking of studies, someone who has due to his or her practice of mindfulness, has been able to notice some of his or her conditioning happening over time. Anyway, this person wonders how they might get involved in your research.
Wonderful. So great questions. I do some online studies. I haven't in a while, but often check things like the Misophonia subreddit. If you're not involved on Reddit, the Misophonia community is pretty huge there, and people will often post studies if there are online surveys to take. There's also a link, I believe soQuiet has a Misophonia research pool that you can sign up for to get involved in online studies. But just generally, like, email the people at your local university and see if there's anyone doing studies in person, because there might be more than you think. Walk around psych buildings and pull the little tabs on the recruitment flyers. There's a lot you can do. But yes, get involved.
Yeah. And there's also soQuiet here. If you go to soQuiet, you can sign up to be part of a research pool through that website. So,
yep.
So that's another good option. Is there any little tidbit that you have that didn't, or maybe a few tidbits that didn't make it to your papers, Dr. Hansen, like something that just really struck you as interesting or important or quirky, but it didn't fit in? Anything to share?
Great question. There's a lot of things I could talk about, but the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that we've talked about context matters. In my first study, I had participants identify sounds for me, and I learned a lot from what people typed to me that sounds were. Things like saying, that's my mother's chewing, or like, that's my brother slurping, showing that it's definitely something that people assign to certain close others. But also things like people saying, well, when I thought it was this ball rolling on the table, it didn't bother me. But then I realized it was slurping, and then I became annoyed. So I've learned a lot from people's responses and feedback to my studies. And I actually have a paper under review right now that is studying that exact sort of whether or not you're able to identify a sound and how that actually influences your response. So definitely there's some cool context identification stuff that is behind the scenes.
That's super interesting. Yes, yeah. One could just put together a whole book on those.
A whole book.
Right. Yes, little facts. So I'm looking through the questions, and I think we've answered all the questions. So
Mary, there was one more at the top. I think it got pushed up about top down and bottom up, just to help explain what that is.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, what you guys mean by top down?
Fair.
Thank you very much for that. I did miss that. So what do we even mean by top down?
Yeah, fair question. I think everyone has different definitions. I'm using it from an attentional definition because that's what I'm most familiar with. But the idea that you identify what something is, either using figuring out just the rudimentary components of it, what we call a bottom-up way, where you say, for instance, like if you're looking at an apple, bottom-up might say like, okay, I see red, I see round, I see shiny, there is a leaf. And then you start to put those pieces together and you figure out it's an apple. Whereas like top down would come from your prior experience, your knowledge about the world, things that are larger, your goals. Maybe if you're in a grocery store and you're like, okay, I know that apples tend to be in the produce section. I know apples tend to be round and shiny and whatever. So then when you are presented an object, you can apply your knowledge and be like, that's an apple. So I think it's, to me, it's kind of a difference between whether it's stimulus driven, whether it's the raw audio noise that you're getting and you're figuring out what it is, or whether or not it's you applying your own knowledge and experience on it to determine how you feel about it, if that makes sense. And also feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because like people think of it differently.
Well, I'm not going to correct the neuroscientist, but maybe someone else here will. No, I think that was a great answer. Let's see. I think that's it. And now we do have 4 minutes before the next presentation. So I'll end, and maybe people need to get a drink of water, take a break. Now's a good time.
That sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Right. Yeah,
Dr.
thanks, Mary.
Hansen. Thank you.
Dr. Petrie. Yes, thank you.